All right, now we have the books of Daniel and Revelation. In this particular part of the study of Bible history series, on the two final books, Daniel and Revelation, these two were put together for a few different reasons. One, they both belong to the same genre, which is apocalyptic literature. Two, one of them, the book of Revelation, is heavily influenced by the other one, the book of Daniel. And three, in both cases, they are final books. In the case of Daniel, when it comes to all of the books of the Jewish Bible, it was the one that was written last. And in the case of Revelation, it is the one that comes last in the New Testament. These two books are often thought of as having future predictions, and I just want to point out how they can also be understood from a historical point of view instead of the typical sensationalist doomsday viewpoint. We're gonna die! All right, so one of the things we've seen throughout the Bible history series is the fact that many times a book in the Bible is set during one particular period, but it is really making statements about another period. For example, the book of Ruth is set during the period of the judges prior to Israel and Judah and appears to be about two of King David's ancestors. However, what it's really talking about is whether or not Jews should marry non-Jews, something that was a big point of discussion during the Persian period, which was when the book was actually written. Daniel is another one of these kind of cases. Although the book is primarily set during the Babylonian period, what is really talking about is the late Hellenistic period, which was when the Seleucid king Antiochus IV was persecuting the Jews. This is something to keep in mind as we explore some of this content. And before we do that, I kind of want to define a couple of terms. You have prophecy and apocalypse, both words that relate to the books of Daniel and Revelation. When people hear the word prophecy, they usually think of a word about a prediction about the future. But in ancient Judaism, that's not necessarily what prophecy meant exactly. A prophecy was simply a warning. Prophets would say something like, look, if you don't change your ways and stop what you're doing, bad things gonna happen. But if you obey God, good things gonna happen. In other words, the future was not set in stone per se. So like the main point of prophecy, like other types of religious writings, was to convince people to get some act right in the present. Same thing when the people hear the word apocalypse, they also tend to think about the future and usually some kind of crappy future events in which the whole world comes to an end.
I'm calling it the end.
Dun, dun, dun.
However, the Greek word apocalypsis simply means an uncovering of something hidden. So again, apocalyptic literature was more about the present of whatever time frame it was written in, rather than it was about the future. All right, so check it out. Prophets be like, see all this bad shit happening? Well, that's because y'all messed up. If you switch up things will get better. Now that sounds kind of funny looking backwards, because for the Jews, things never got better. The Jews continued to be ruled by foreign powers over and over and over again. First the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Ptolemies, then the Seleucids. So as you go along, you see the prophets pretty much decided to take a different approach. What they basically said now was, see all this bad stuff happening? Well, that's because on another level, there's like this hidden war going on and stuff between good and evil, but don't trip, because God's eventually gonna win. Eventually. Sometime. So apocalyptic literature was an attempt to uncover and reveal a hidden world. It was an attempt to encourage people and let them know that God was still somehow in control, even when it seemed like, What apocalyptic literature was not trying to do was to provide an exact blueprint for the future. So now that we know why these books were written and have that premise in mind, let's see if some of the more famous passages from them make a little bit more sense. In Daniel chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream in which he sees a statue with a head of gold, arms of silver, thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet a part of iron and part clay. Growing up, I was exposed to various literature by Hal Lindsey, John Hagee, and Jack Van Impe. Late Great Planet Earth kind of bullshit, stuff that was taught that this statue was a blueprint for the future, given to Daniel during the Babylonian period. I was told that the head represented Babylon, the arms represented Persia, the thighs represented Greece, and the legs represented Rome, with 10 toes representing various medieval and modern powers from Europe. From Kaiseric to Odoacer, Theodoric, Justinian, Charlemagne, Otto I, Charles V, Napoleon, Garibaldi, and eventually the Antichrist. This view was sometimes modified, especially when the European Union was formed. Then it became about 13 nations, and 3 would eventually become 1, which was going to be the Antichrist, who was about to appear any day now to lead it. However, if we accept the viewpoint that Daniel was actually written by an anonymous author, because it was, During the Greek period, a different interpretation actually makes way more sense. Instead of describing the future, the author was actually describing the past, up to the time of the writing. Understood this way, the head represents Babylon, the arms represent the Medes, the thighs represent Persia, and the two legs represent the two Greek kingdoms, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, with the 10 toes representing 10 Hellenistic rulers that had ruled Judea up until that point, which would be Alexander the Great, Alexander IV, Ptolemy I, II, III, IV, V, Antiochus III, Seleucus IV, and Antiochus IV. Anyway, at the end of the dream, a large rock from heaven destroys the statue and God establishes his own kingdom. What the author of Daniel was hoping for was not some future kingdom hundreds or even thousands of years in the future, but for an independent Judaic kingdom to be established in the present, something that did in fact happen around the time of its writings, thanks to the Maccabees. We get a similar prophecy in Daniel chapter 7. This time it's actually Daniel who has the dream. In his dream, he sees a series of 4 creatures rising out of the sea: a lion, a bear, a 4-headed leopard, and an unknown beast with 10 horns. These are often taught to represent 4 kingdoms, and that those 4 kingdoms were Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Daniel goes on to see a little horn appear on the 4th beast that has eyes like a man and a mouth that speaks arrogantly. This is often said to be a future Antichrist who is about to appear sometime soon. Any day now. But as you might have guessed, there is another way to understand this dream, one that is based on actual history as opposed to future predictions and throwing jello on the wall, seeing what sticks. Like with the statue, it's more likely that the 4 beasts were originally meant to represent the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, and the Greeks. The Romans weren't depicted because the Roman Empire simply didn't exist yet. As for the little horn, it was almost certainly a reference to Antiochus IV, the Seleucid king who was ruling at the time of the book of Daniel when it was written. Now this guy is a piece of work, and I'll explain what he did as we go on. But I want to bring up Daniel chapter 9, which is one of the most argued about chapters in the entire Bible. Here's where we find what is called the 70 weeks prophecy. It's actually a great example of how prophetic ideas were often changed and even updated over time. The chapter starts with Daniel reading the words of an earlier prophet, the prophet Jeremiah. And according to Jeremiah, Judah was going to be under the control of Babylon for 70 years. Now, from the perspective of whoever wrote Daniel, those 70 years never really came to an end, because although the Jews were able to go home to their own land, they remained under the control of foreign powers. First it was Babylon, then Persia, then the Ptolemies, then the Seleucids. It didn't really end. So what the author of Daniel decided to do was to put a new spin on Jeremiah's words. Instead of 70 years, it was going to be 70 weeks of years, meaning 70 times 7 or 490. But according to the next few verses, those 490 years could now be divided into 3 parts. First, there's a period of 7 weeks. 7 times 7 equals 49. Then there's a period of 62 weeks. 62 times 7 equals 434.
Hey, that's a lot of math, bro.
We'll get a calculator, fool.
This class sucks.
Finally, there's one remaining week, which equals 7 years. And according to the book of Daniel, something really big was going to happen halfway through the last week. In other words, after 3.5 years. Some of this language is even found in the book of Revelation. Now, according to most Christians, the 70 weeks prophecy is about Jesus. The most commonly used argument is that the 49 years represents the time between 457 BCE and 408 BCE, which according to some timelines is when Ezra was given the go-ahead to rebuild the temple. The 430 years then represents the time between 408 BCE and 26 CE, being the approximate date from when Jesus began his ministry. Finally, in the spring of 30 CE, which would have been 3.5 years after Jesus started his ministry, he was killed. Thus, according to many Christians, the big event prophesied in Daniel chapter 9 was the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Now, I'm not going to flat out say that this interpretation is wrong. If you're a Christian, I do understand that seeing certain things in the Jewish Bible as pointing towards Jesus as an important part of your belief system. However, I am not of that strict belief system that it has to be. Whether they do or don't makes no difference to me. As a student of Christianity and a student of Judaism and a student of history, because I already include the Christian perspective, I want to include also how the Jews view this perspective, or even how this passage can be understood from a strictly historical point of view. I'm going to give you an alternative information and let you draw your own informed decisions. And again, it all hinges on the realization that the book of Daniel was written in the late Hellenistic period, just prior to the Maccabean revolt, and that the author was building upon an earlier prophecy made by Jeremiah. So let's start there. In Jeremiah 25 verse 1, it says, "The word which came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the 4th year of King Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah of Judah, which was the 1st year of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon." He then goes on to give a bunch of details, the most important part which is given in verse 11. "This whole land shall be a desolate ruin, and those nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Okay, so this is great. I like this because Jeremiah's prophecy begins with some very clear reference points. He says he's speaking in the 4th year of Jehoiakim's reign, which was the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, which we know is 605 BCE. So 605 BCE is the starting date for Jeremiah's 70 years, and by extension, also the starting date for Daniel's 490 years. Okay, so let's talk about the 7 weeks first. 49 years after 605 BCE would be 556 BCE. Interesting, something very important did happen around this time. You see, Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BCE and was succeeded by his son, Marduk. At some point during Marduk's reign, he released Jehoiakim from prison. Jehoiakim, who was called the Anointed One by Daniel, who was the last independent king of Judah. Jehoiakim's descendants would then go on to serve as exilarchs of the Jewish people. Let's now talk about the 62 weeks or the 434 years. Many people assume that the 434 years here should come after the 49 years. However, there's nothing in the original Hebrew that requires it to be understood this way. In other words, it could also mean 434 years from the year 605 BCE. This would bring us to the year 171 BCE, which was also a very important year indeed. This was the year that the high priest Onias III was executed by Antiochus IV. Onias III was seen as being the last legitimate priest from an original line of high priests. A few years before his execution, Onias had been replaced by his brother Jason and then by a man named Menelaus, both of whom bribed Antiochus in order to get into their position. And so this fits with Daniel's description of the Anointed One disappearing at this time. So what about the 3.5 years then? Well, approximately 3.5 years after the death of Onias, another absolutely astonishing major event occurred. In the year 167 BCE, Antiochus IV put a stop to the Jewish sacrifices at the temple and instead sacrificed a pig to Zeus. For the Jews at the time, there was nothing that could be more horrible than that. Here's how Daniel described it. At the corner of the altar will be an appalling abomination. I think it's far more likely that the abomination referred to in Daniel chapter 9 is the very thing Antiochus IV did around the time that the book of Daniel was written than it is a reference to the death of Jesus. Antiochus IV is the little horn of Daniel's dream. Okay, so let's move on to the book of Revelation. This book opens up with, "I, John, your brother and companion, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus." Okay, so in this first chapter, the author names himself as John and states that he was writing from the island of Patmos, where he is being imprisoned for being a Christian. This is a great detail because this allows us to date the book to either the 60s CE or the 90s CE, which are the first 2 periods in which Christians were persecuted, first under Emperor Nero and then second under Emperor Domitian. Most scholars lean towards the date of around 95 CE, making Revelation one of the last books of the New Testament to be written. In addition, most scholars feel that the John who wrote Revelation is not the same John who wrote the Gospel, nor the John that wrote the 3 epistles of John. But either way, Revelation was written at least 230 years after the book of Daniel, and a lot happened in those 230 years. The most notable thing being, well, the rise of the Roman Empire, which went on to conquer all the Hellenistic kingdoms as well as the kingdom of Judea. But another way to look at it is, well, not much changed at all. The Jews were still being ruled by a foreign power as they always were. It's just now that the foreign power was now Rome. This is made clear in Revelation chapter 13, where John describes a beast rising from the sea. He describes this beast as being part lion, part bear, part leopard, and having 7 heads and 10 horns. This is obviously referring back to the 4 beasts in the book of Daniel. But here he combines the 4 beasts into a single creature, basically saying that Rome is the successor to the previous 4 kingdoms and is just as bad as the previous 4 combined. This beast is still often taught as the Roman Empire that would usher in the end of the world. However, like I said earlier, apocalyptic literature wasn't necessarily about providing a blueprint for the future. It was about describing what was happening in the present. And when John was writing Revelation, the present reality consisted of Rome persecuting Jews and Christians. John was trying to peel back the layers of what was happening to reveal a hidden cosmic battle that he claimed God would eventually win. We can see further evidence for this in verse 18, where he mentions one of the most famous numbers in the entire Bible, 666. Over the centuries, there have been a lot of theories about what this number means, most of which are just batshit crazy. But considering it is stated as the number of a man, one theory that does make sense is that the number was a code word for Nero, which is the first emperor to persecute Christians. Utilizing Hebrew gematria, if you switch the Greek consonants with Hebrew consonants and then add up the numbers each associated to those consonants, you get 666. Or, if you switch the Latin consonants with the Hebrew consonants, you get 616, which some scholars argue is the more accurate translation of the number. There are two other famous passages from Revelation that I want to explore. The first is in chapter 4, where John is describing God sitting on a throne. In verse 7, he describes 4 living creatures that sit around the throne. These are different from the 4 creatures that we discussed earlier. This time they look like a lion, an ox, a man, and an eagle. And instead of being based on something from the book of Daniel, these creatures are actually based on a passage from Ezekiel, where they are portrayed as being angels. So this is yet another example of one prophetic book putting a new spin on an older prophetic book. In Christian tradition, the 4 living creatures are usually thought as representing the 4 gospel writers, something that can be seen in lots of Christian artwork throughout the centuries. Out of the many gospels that were available, 4 were selected, and the use of the tetramorph was heavily influenced by Irenaeus and later others. Remember, the prophet Ezekiel lived amongst the Jews who were exiled to Babylon in 6th century BCE. The creatures in his vision, from which the images of the tetramorph are derived, are reminiscent of ancient Assyrian art. We can definitely see its influences on prior works of art originally used by the Babylonians, ancient Egyptians, Assyrians, and Greeks. Now, whether this is a literal reference to literal creatures around God's throne or a reference to Leo, Taurus, Aquarius, and Scorpio cosmologies is open for discussion. Various ancients, including Egyptians, also believe that the sun is carried around in its circuit by a chariot with 4 horsemen. And speaking of the 4 horsemen, that brings me to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. These famous characters show up in Revelation chapter 6. Again, we get a set of 4 creatures, but this time all 4 are horses. But they're differently colored horses: white, red, black, and pale. And as you guessed it, different colored horses show up in different prophetic books. They show up in Ezekiel and Zechariah, and are quite clearly meant to represent punishment sent by God. There have been all kinds of theories about what exactly the 4 horsemen in Revelation represent, with war and famine and disease being very common suggestions. Once again, the imagery has inspired lots of art over the centuries. But as with everything else discussed, the imagery is not necessarily about the future predictions, but rather about present realities at the time of writing. After all, war, famine, and disease were all things that were present during the Roman times. All right, so that wraps up the apocalyptic literature. I hope that educates and informs.